Welcome to Eagle Harbor's Sustainability Outreach and Educational Workshop Series, funded by Prince George's County, Maryland, Department of Environment under the Stormwater Stewardship Award Program and the Chesapeake Bay Trust. Today's workshop will be number 2, the Patuxent River. What can we do to help raise the grade? The guest speaker, Fred TUTMAN, the Patuxent River Keeper.
Welcome everybody. This is workshop number 2, which is part of the Prince George County Chesapeake Bay Stormwater Grant that the town of Eagle Harbor received. This workshop is going to be presented by our dear friend, the Patuxent River Keeper, Fred TUTMAN. So without any further delay.
So thank you. I appreciate it. So it's been a while since I've talked to the town in this fashion. And while the assignment has been to create a presentation about stormwater and flooding and climate change, I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about who the Patuxent River Keeper is, because some of you haven't had that conversation with the first frame freeze. And some of this is also germane, because a lot of people do not know, for better or for worse, the Patuxent River Keeper is the originator of the current stormwater regime in the state. We were the ones that dreamed it up, lobbied the heck out of it, got a grant from an organization in Massachusetts called the Proteus Action Fund to change the stormwater culture in the state, which is why I bought a boombox, because we did jingles, we did flyers, we worked for 3 years in the General Assembly to get a new regime passed for a very particular reason. Well, let me get into the presentation and I'll tell you what some of those reasons were. I need to stop moving, don't I? Because I'm on that camera. Okay. So first, a little bit about how I got here. This is where I live. A little picture, maybe 20, 30 years old. My great-grandfather started a farm near the Patuxent River on Queen Anne Road, north of here, back in the 1920s. He had a smaller place nearby, near where Porter Ridge Shopping Center is now, we're told. He wanted more land. And the county sheriff of Prince George's County in the 1890s was a guy who used to do freelance lynchings. He really used to string up people in his front yard. In fact, in my front yard is the actual hanging tree used by this guy. He used to do this for extra money. They say he used to pass the hat because you could actually raise money at a quote good lynching. People would come and actually donate money to watch something like that go down. They say the last guy that he strung up was guilty of nothing in particular. Put a hex on him. Told him he was going to go straight to the dogs. Crop failure. His wife died of consumption. His cattle died. And so the place went into foreclosure. My great-grandfather was able to buy the place out of foreclosure, First Maryland National Bank, and basically got a deal for $5,000. He got a lot of acres, some 400 some acres plus. In 1920 something, that was all the money in the world to my great-grandfather. He started having a family and had one daughter after the other, named a couple of those daughters male names. He wanted a workforce, instead got daughters, which is hilarious because the eldest or youngest of those daughters is still alive. This is my great-grandmother I'm talking to. She's 94 years old, lives in DC. My Aunt Hilda, who calls me from time to time and says, how are things on the ass end of a mule? Because she said when she could have been on dates with boys, she was instead walking behind that mule on the North 40. So the point is, on that farm, on this farm, women did all the work anyhow. As much as my great-grandfather wanted a male workforce, he ended up with the workforce that actually did all of that work on that place. All of my ancestors worked on that place. Next slide, please. It's my grandmother on the left and the far left, who loved Eagle Harbor. Her and her third husband, she outlived 3 husbands. She married a guy named Brown, and then another guy named Brown, and then a guy named Fur. And so we called her Hazel Brown Brown Fur. And she loved Eagle Harbor. She said the nicest people in the world lived at Eagle Harbor. And she and her husband, Mr. Fur, Charlie Fur, who's in that tractor. That's my mother next to her, by the way, who was 87, still going strong, lives next door to me. And my grandmother's mother, Big Mom, Mary Jones. So they did everything on that farm. They raised their own crops. They made their own clothes. My mother still makes her own clothes on a 1922 Singer sewing machine, which she pedals with her feet. You know, she's like Gandhi, basically. So we were tied to that particular place and still are, that particular piece of land. In those days, they grew tobacco, they grew cotton, but they grew their own vegetables and all of their own stuff. They had hogs, all of that stuff. And so as much as the river in that era, when I was growing up, at least in the well, not in that era, but in the later era, when I was growing up in the 60s, was pretty much segregated. He couldn't get to the river on Queen Anne Road, right? The land close to the river was owned by wealthy folks and was restricted. And so we couldn't get there. Next slide, please. We knew where the river was in a general way, but we didn't have easy access to that river. So it's stuck on a frame.
Mm.
There's Devil. Yeah, it'll do it. And I mentioned this because it wasn't until I was an adult that I started paying attention to what was going on with the Patuxent. I didn't really know where the Patuxent came from. I mean, I knew it was came from that way and went the other way. I knew where it was in my neighborhood, but I didn't know it was connected to something bigger. That realization didn't until much later. Oh, I did mention that in addition to my grandmother coming to Eagle Harbor, and here, by the way, she and Charlie Furr used to hunt. We used to go to crabs. They had a little crab stand on Route 301, fruit and vegetables that they had grown on the farm, but also crabs they had caught at Eagle Harbor. But the other connection I have to Eagle Harbor is my father's cousin Connie, who's actually on one of those golden plaques. Connie, oh wait, yeah, she's my father's I think second cousin actually. And I knew Connie. I used to visit Connie in Eagle Harbor. So it's a river keeper.
Cousin,
Pardon me?
I think you're a cousin.
Oh,
Somewhere
yours?
down the left.
Oh, no. Right, yeah, could be, more than likely. Oh, that's me and my great grandfather, Carter Jones. Actually, my nickname was Hobby as a kid. Carter Jones, the interesting guy. He would only drive Chevys, never Ford, hated Henry Ford, would only drive a Chevy. He made his own liquor. His arm is crooked. You can see here, this is a permanent crook. His mother, they say, broke his arm for him to keep him out of military service because they needed him on the farm.
Oh.
So think about a mother's love. She took him to the nearest tree, stuck it in the crotch in the tree, yanked on it until it broke, and set it herself. And so he never was able to straighten that arm because it was kind of a homemade project to create that. Next slide, please. But the connection between the farm and the river was a strong one. We drafted river water for crops, swam in the river. Like I said, we didn't have an easy access. We had to go to public access points, which was at bridges and crossroads and places like that. My family moved us to Africa in the 60s. So my primary education is actually a British education, which is why I probably don't have a Maryland accent as much as I'm from Maryland. I didn't really live here for a number of years. And I also didn't go to school most of the time in Africa. My father thought it was better for me to learn in the lab of life. My point being that most of my environmental sentiments really come from game parks in East Africa and Tanzania and Kenya and places like that where my parents took us. And I used to ride on riverboats in West Africa in Sierra Leone. And there, rivers are like highways. I mean, it's like a bus line. People are moving up and down the river, goods, sheep, chickens, all kinds of stuff. If you're on a riverboat going up an African river, at least in that part of the world, you can't really tell where a village is because people didn't put trails near the river because they said that enemies could find those trails, right, and invade a village. And so these places were places where you had to kind of know where you were in order to find the town because there was no sign or nothing that really told them that. But I ended up going to a British boarding school in the Usambara Mountains, Tanzania. The Usambara Mountains is a place where it snows, even though it's below the equator. During the Apollo landing in 1969, that's where I was. I heard it on a shortwave radio with a bunch of my buddies who were pretty forlorn looking. This was one of the worst Catholic schools in the world. It is actually in the credits of the movie Spotlight. If you saw it, they just settled their case with the Vatican just last year. I was immune from bad treatment because I was the only African-American child in the school. And my father had power. My father had juice. I was not a kid that you would mess with. My best friend right there, Martin, and I can't believe I remember this because that was a long time ago. Martin Michael Alexander George Marriott. My theory was that his parents couldn't decide which ancestor to name him after, so they named him after all those ancestors. Martin was one of the most abused children in that school, actually. But at any rate, next slide, please. I remember vividly walking through the hills of the Usambara Mountains. There were abandoned German tanks from World War II because the Germans had been profiteering and prospecting for gold up in the mountains of Tanzania. There were amazing smells. And again, it was an environmental experience. We were quarantined at that school some of the time because we had European illnesses to which the local people did not have immunity. This is a part of the world where the Maasai pulled forth, right? And I saw a Maasai wearing German medals from graves that had been robbed. Can you imagine seeing a Maasai warrior with a spear and a Maltese cross hanging from his ear? I mean, it's kind of surreal, kind of post-apocalyptic. Back here in the States, in Baltimore, my father, who had married the farmer's daughter, was a city guy from Druid Hill Avenue. And he used to send me and my sisters to Baltimore to hang out with our cousins in the summer because he wanted us to experience his upbringing in the city. And there, my cousins took me to a VFW post where a guy in a battered brown suit named Herbert Frisbee, Dr. Herbert Frisbee, held forth about the polar explorer Matthew Henson. Frisbee was a high school teacher in the Baltimore system who had devoted his life to celebrating the accomplishments of Matthew Henson, who went with Admiral Peary to the North Pole. He started the Matthew Henson Society, which exists to this day. And it was the first time I saw a person of color portrayed as someone who could be an explorer. It had never occurred to me at age, I don't know how old I was, 8, 9, 10, somewhere around there, like, wow, Black people can do anything. We can go to the moon, we can go to the North Pole. His other pictures, when I found the internet, Frisbee's in the middle, you can't miss it. He's the smallest guy there. In his 70s, he convinced the Air Force to take him to the North Pole. He couldn't walk there, he was pretty old, so they flew him over the North Pole. But he was a real inspiration to me, actually, as was my mother's uncle, who helped found the Baltimore Aquarium, or National Aquarium, they call it in Baltimore. He was a fish freak. Uncle Sugar, short for sugar, we used to call Uncle Sugar. I used to feed the fish at his house on Dolphin Street in Baltimore in the summer sometimes. Next slide, please. We're gonna get the stormwater and other stuff in a minute, please. So I started the Patuxent River Civic Association, moved on to the family farm, used to take my kid out on the river. She's 30-something now back here. Gosh, I don't know how old she was. She's not interested in the river. She told me she's a Barbie. Dad, I'm a Barbie. I'm not interested in that outdoor stuff and those river hippies you hang out with whatsoever. But right about 2000, I decided to go to law school. I'd been working in television and radio. I had followed up on my earlier life in Africa by literally covering Africa for various television networks. I worked for CBS, NBC, CNN, Canadian Broadcasting, German television, you name them at various times. I worked on over 25 years, a profession that probably doesn't exist anymore. I was an unaffiliated stringer, meaning a freelance contract journalist who worked before 911 for virtually anybody who would hire me. I can remember in the 80s calling the BBC London desk looking for work, and the woman said, "Oh, Fred TUTMAN, you are our favorite Negro stringer." But we don't have any Negro stories now. Call us in a couple of weeks. Maybe we'll have a Negro story for you then. I can remember that quite vividly. But I had a good time working in television and radio. I traveled a lot. I met a lot of interesting people. I worked with Ronald Reagan, gave him jokes, didn't care for his politics, but he liked the jokes that I gave him. He would always write them down. Can I use that? Can I get the punchline? MTV hired me to tour with The Who. So I traveled with those guys. I mean, I spent 25 years, and at the end of that, I felt like we hadn't done a darn thing to help anybody except ourselves. I was really interested in pursuing a different career in a different direction. And I see environmental work as largely civil rights work. I guarantee you, the more activated, the louder you get, the cleaner your water, the cleaner your air, the cleaner your neighborhood. Next slide, please. So after my law school education, these are earlier slides from me doing my thing in the field. I started out literally as a cameraman when cameras weighed 30 pounds, which is probably why I need a shoulder replacement now. I mean, it was a long time ago. It really blew out my knees and my shoulders and all that stuff. Later, I became a writer and a director and a producer. I did a lot of different stuff in television and in radio. But I had enough. Next slide, please. The Dukakis Convention, where I almost lost my mind, to be honest. The hardest work I've ever done, actually, in the field. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the environmental side of things. And I kind of fell into that. I was excited by a book that Bobby Kennedy had written. And incidentally, I think he's making a total mess right now out there trying to run for president. I don't know what his end game is, frankly. But that said, I saw it as kind of an insider movement. It was mostly white. It was mostly people who knew various terms and expressions and ideas about the environment. But there wasn't like this conversation going on with people generally. They were the insiders and the outsiders. And that really bothered me, because I knew that a lot of these outsiders had genuine environmental issues, problems, concerns, and connections to the environment. People of color were largely defined as diversity, which annoys me because I think we're stakeholders. We're bigger than diversity. We are real stakeholders in these issues who have a lot to bring to the table. These movements would be better if there were more of us in them, because I think they don't know everything. Right? We know stuff, they know stuff, we all know stuff, but these bigger and broader movements, I think, fundamentally are bigger. So I make the analogy of dogs playing poker because the dogs make deals amongst themselves, they know where the stuff is, they can get funding, they can do all of this stuff. And that dynamic really bothers me. So I started out to create an environmental organization exactly like the kind that I would myself join. In fact, I am a member of Patuxent River. Okay, next slide, please. So we don't take corporate money. We're very zealous about helping communities activate and own their own problems and do self-help. We help them get the resources, the technical advice they need, anything that these communities need to fight their own fights, because I believe that's durable work. That's work that won't disappear with grants. That's work that, again, if the community owns, they'll pay it forward. Problems where the community builds its own leadership from within. To me, those are much more sustainable movements than, let's be clear what those other movements are. They're corporate funded. I don't see the solutions to the world's environmental problems from corporate money. I just don't see it. Just don't see it. I just can't imagine how that would be. Nor can I see the future of the planet in the hands of movements that only reflect a single point of view. White-run movements are insufficient to attack these problems, either morally, they lack the moral force to speak on behalf of anything outside of their realm. But more importantly, they're not their resources. They belong to all of us. So when that began to dawn on me, about 8 or 9 or 10 years in, I ended up to go public and say exactly what I thought. So I wrote an article that got syndicated all over the country. The Washington Post ran, Baltimore Sun ran, calling "Take Off the Blinders: Why Green is Not the New Black, Yellow, or Red." And instead of the reaction I thought I would get, half my board quit. Walked right on the spot. Next slide, please. This is the board I got the next day. People read that article and said, you know, I'd like to be involved with an organization that is trying to open those doors, knock down those barriers, really create a new norm in these movements, a norm that is collective, that is inclusive, and that is equitable. So these are the folks who share that vision, and they're mostly pretty solid. These are folks that have had my back through open heart surgery, through numerous lawsuits. In the last 20 years, Patuxent Riverkeeper has garnered some $750 million in fines, penalties, make goods, environmental special projects from polluters on the river. That money's gone entirely back into the river, into the communities we serve. Next slide. By the way, could you back up? Do you have the ability? Is that like,
Yes, I do.
or is that like dancing with Fred Astaire backwards and I want to mention Tracy McCurdy is an interesting lawyer. She's been on our board for a long time, and she runs the Black Belt Justice Center. She works in the South, helping people of color keep their property. She helps them keep air property. That's the entire mission of the Black Belt Justice Center. Particularly when you have people who die and the land is not partitioned, right? And you have these forced sales because nobody can figure out, you know, which portion of the land belongs to whom. And so essentially she's involved with legal work that helps families retain the mass of Black land ownership in the country. And I think it's pretty exciting work. And several other people on the board are also full-time activists doing that. Dr. Sapulti Wilson, who I think has been here, and now his students have been here. He's a Mississippi-born activist. I knew his favorite professor very well. That's where I met him, was through Steve Wing. Steve Wing was a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, who passed away the day that Trump got elected. Actually, he died of cancer. We think he got at Fukushima. He was an epidemiologist, a researcher, and he loved this guy. And he poured a lot of attention and focus into this guy and several other students. The other side of this is Chris Haney, of course, in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins. These two students were the pride and joy of Steve Wing. Next slide, please. And my point being, these are still civil rights activists as much as they're environmentalists. They're not techies, right? They're not insiders. They're not dogs playing poker. These are people committed to the idea that you can't even deal with the environmental problems until you deal with the social disparities as well. They go together. They're companions. So our office is upriver. It's a facility we rent for $1 a year from your county park agency. The building they were going to knock down. Now we're responsible for it, which comes with all of those hooks. We had to replace the air conditioning system last week entirely. The roof is ready for repair. But it's a great place for us in terms of us running summer camps and running kind of a clubhouse on the river. Next slide, please. So in addition to all the other stuff we do with litigation, we run crews that clear snags on the river. We hold ceremony at the office. We rent boats. It's kind of a three-ring circus of stuff that goes on at Patuxent River Keeper, but we zealously work the 7 counties of the Patuxent, as far north as Columbia, as far south as Solomons. Next slide. That's like what it really is. And we mobilize what I call constructive dissent, where you channel your energy into places where it's going to change something for the better, right? We're non-violent. I think people think of us pugnacious because we are litigious at times, but I guarantee you, if somebody got sued by Patuxent River Keeper, it wasn't an ambush. They saw us coming a mile away, right? We're pretty, honorable people. We go to people and ask nicely. And asking nicely doesn't help. We ask even more strenuously. And it doesn't work. Eventually, you might find yourself in court fighting the Patuxent River Keeper. And we've had a lot of support over the years for various legal clinics associated with various law schools in the area. A couple of them I actually teach. I teach at American University's law school from time to time. I teach at Vermont Law School from time to time. Mostly classes related to environmental justice and environmentalism in general. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can kind of keep cycling. So a lot of different events, a lot of different interest groups represented, a lot of Indigenous and Native American people connected to the organization. And there again, ceremony, enormously important, the spiritual side of what the living is about. Next slide, please. And the Roughnecks crew, which maintains trails in the freshwater upper sections of the river, basically clearing snags and briars, putting up signs, doing local rescue stuff. Next slide, please. The summer camp that we're running, it's ongoing. Actually, the next cycle starts next week. The summer camp, incidentally, is funded by money from the state of Maryland that came about as a result of our civil rights complaint in Brandywine. The state realized there was a cold spot. There weren't a lot of things for kids to do in the summer in the Brandywine area. And so they set us some money and said, see if you can squeeze 2 or 3 years of summer camps out of this, such that there will be more opportunities for kids to do outdoors stuff. And so we built it largely around mentoring. Finding mentors for kids to work with them on various outdoor skills and things they want to do. This guy in the center, Dr. Paul, is a retired special forces guy, and kids love it. He takes them out in the field. I bet you could teach them how to kill with their bare hands, but we don't have that. He says he has 75 combat missions behind it, including guarding a pipeline in Ukraine for a while. But he mostly teaches survivalism through the lens of his special forces training. Catch fish, they track deer, they read a compass, they learn how to read a map. These are all very solid hands-on skills that people get from this guy's training. But there are other mentors involved as well. Next slide, please. And these are some of our collaborators, the puppeteers and the fire breathers and the other stuff that we deal with from North Carolina and other places. Next slide. Taking Nature Black, one of the conferences we started. We now have a new one called the Black to the Future Nature Alliance, again, to connect Black professionals and folks in the environmental community to each other. Because again, the dogs playing poker phenomenon makes it harder for them to connect inside those other movements that, I won't say are close to us, but where it's harder for us sometimes to be ourselves because we've got that label that says diversity on our face, right? As though somehow that's definitive. It's not. I don't believe it's definitive at all. We published these signs, Birders of the Feathers, after that event in New York, and we sold a ton of them online. And I see them from time to time. I see them popping up. Same with our license plates. I see them all over the place. We have Patuxent River Keeper state license plates as well. Next slide, please. And last but not least, before I get into the stormwater part, Belonging, which is a federally funded ebook that is free. You can search for it and find it online, or shoot me an email. I'll send you the link. And it's entirely people of color telling our stories in the environment, like our perspective about things that we experience and know about within the environment. It's a beautiful book shot by some really excellent photographers. And that's what the Belonging thing is about. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can go through this. It's multilingual stuff and all of that. Next slide. So, all right, so let's talk a little bit about Eagle Harbor, sustainability, flooding, and so forth. Next slide, please. An older map, probably pretty hard to see from where you're sitting, unfortunately, on this little tiny screen. Have the next slide, please. It's a little more. So this is a map the state did a few years ago, which is probably out of date. It actually shows the exposure that Eagle Harbor has on its waterfront. Let's see. Storm surge areas, category 1. So in other words, category 1 is 5 to 7 feet of flood proneness on the waterfront. You can kind of see that Eagle Harbor is kind of in the prime spot to get some serious flooding as storm events come and go, right? They get much more severe. I will say that we get a lot of calls when there's a hurricane stuff in the forecast, like Isabel. Agnes, for those of you old enough to remember, Agnes was traumatic for people in this watershed. It knocked down bridges, destroyed whole sections of the river. There's actually a bridge in Laurel that dropped into the river, it's still in there, left over from Agnes. Agnes was cataclysmic. And when we sometimes get calls in flood season, is this going to be like Agnes? Do I need to get my doghouse out of the floodplain? You know, that kind of stuff. Eagle Harbor being a waterfront place, we've done a couple of, I would say, conversations with the town about advanced planning because of this vulnerability. The frontmost part of the town, the water side of the town actually has. It's a tough one, isn't it? Because it's a mature town. It's been here a long time. Your infrastructure is kind of in place. It's kind of hard to pick up the community center, for example, and move it 7 feet back, right? I don't see that happen. So I do think the town needs to start thinking very proactively about these storm events. I don't know that there's I think someone told me there was a disaster plan specific to Eagle Harbor, but I don't know that for a fact. I know there's one for the county, but I don't know that Eagle Harbor had its own. Worth considering. It's something I lobbied for, by the way, at the Patuxent River Commission. I think the river itself should have a disaster plan because these are foreseeable events. I don't know that I'm a guy who understands the science behind climate change. It's credible to me because as a guy connected to land, particularly in a particular place, I see the earth changing. I see things that have never been this way before in my lifetime. Here's a weird example. Where I live on a hilltop next to that hanging tree, I never had to rake leaves because the winds come like clockwork in the fall and blow all those leaves right into the woods. The winds are gone. First time in my lifetime, those winds are gone. The last 2 or 3 years, I've not seen those winds. They don't come anymore. When I was a kid, we used to ice skate on the farm. There was cold, we had snow events. Nothing like what we have now, a very different kind of climate pattern, very different rhythm to the planet. So I know that our human intervention in the Earth's rhythms has actually changed the way the Earth is behaving. And so now I feel as though almost anything goes. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, but hope for the best and plan for the worst. It's kind of my philosophy about this. Next slide, please. Might be hard to see from a distance. This is the other place I work. I also teach in the graduate studies department at Goddard College in Vermont, which is in Plainfield, pretty far north. And that last hour and a half drive to Plainfield, and not out there with moose and bears. You have to gas up and just go for it because there are no gas stations out there either. Montpelier is the nearest town, and it's underwater. In fact, this movie theater, you barely see the movie theater, is one I've gone to several times. This is where I actually go shopping. In fact, I'm due back at Goddard in about 2 weeks. Actually, I'll be curious to see how much of that floodwater has sustained. The campus was almost obliterated. It was inaccessible. As of last week, one of the deans sent us an email, and they had closed the college. They had no internet, no services. People couldn't get there, and there's a dam. They're watching the dam to make sure it doesn't bust free and wipe out the whole deal. You're not nearly as exposed in quite this way. But my point being, this is real. Yeah, this ain't going away anytime soon, at least not in our lifetimes. Yeah. Next slide, please. It's more Eagle Harbor mapping. It really maps, I think, the creek that is being worked on right now. Yes, if I have a text map. I don't know if this tells us much that's useful. Obviously, all of you know, because a series of slides. Why don't you do the next one, please? Next one again, please. Right, familiar state, particularly most Jones, and worse. I think we've all seen kind of worse. I think the biggest exposure, I think the creek is probably the most, I don't know if it's the only creek that runs the city, but it is, or town rather, but it is the one, I think, that's getting the most attention because it has the most flood potential, obviously, for the roads and streets and for public health and for public safety. It is obviously unsustainable to keep retrofitting these streets. I mean, otherwise, right, would you keep on retrofitting them until the end of time? Unless you've corrected the problem that created the flooding, which remains a concern. I still don't really know, for example, what kinds of flows are anticipated in that stream going over time. I know that the contractors I suggested there's a lifespan of X number of years, foreseeable flows, the 10-year floodplain, and all that stuff. Again, I guess my take on it is, will it work or will it not? And truly, I think we don't really have all of those answers. We're going by what the best engineering and science could tell us on this. But again, what other vulnerabilities does the town have? I do think some of your people right up against the waterfront could face real hardship going forward, and possibly insurance problems potentially as well. Has anybody actually investigated? There's an insurance issue attached to some of the folks who have flood exposure on the front. Yeah,
You will be in the floodplain, most insurance companies don't cover
yeah.
property or flood. So I feel it's already to ask this
Please,
question.
by all means.
So as we see this body of water here, and the engineering firm has said that they can't predict what's going to happen.
Mhm.
But right now, we know that that water
Mhm.
is contributed 29 acres of cleared impervious surface
Right,
on Pepco property
right.
contribute to this water.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if they clear 10 more acres
Mm.
and drain it to that 29, then that would be 39, and that would be, have anyone in any of their engineering studies took that into consideration, whatever they do on the plant within that, that area will affect down here. Have you heard anyone say that they looked into that?
No, I've not been privy to those conversations if they have occurred. I think what's in the weeds here, I'm not thrilled this is on YouTube. This might come back to haunt us. I'm not thrilled about two things here. I'm not thrilled that a federal subsidy is about to offset what Pepco might have had to pay for. In other words, they're less willing to pay for anything if they think there's a federal grant that's going to cover anything that they might have contributed to. But also, I feel like they're in a gray area in terms of their regulatory compliance. Can we hold them to the idea that the flows will either A, not increase over time, or that they will take positive action to assure that's not the case? Because all the math that the contractor is using on this thing presumes that the flows are as they are now, right? Any number of things could happen that might contribute in the future to additional flows for which this engineering plan is not designed to handle. Right? I think there's some headroom there. I think there's some wiggle room in terms of their calculations. But to me, the part that the town has no control over is what they're doing at that switchyard.
Right.
Do they maintain it? Do they expand it? Are there any number of things that could occur that I see over time? An agreement between Pepco and the town to that effect might be a way to do that. I don't think it's good use of resources to litigate over this, but opening a conversation with the plant about the realities of this shared creek that you share with the town and their contribution to it, and some kind of bargaining agreement between the operators of that switch yard. It's not the plant, right? It's the switch yard. It's the
Right.
yeah,
Correct.
right, exactly.
But
Might be worth exploring.
like I said, if they go and decide to escalate
Mhm.
on their property,
Mhm.
unbeknownst to the town, or they can just be doing landscaping or whatever, but if they send 10 additional acres of impervious surface, that would totally destroy what we're getting ready to do with the cold reef.
There is that potential. I don't think that's the case, but if I were dotting the i's and crossing the t's, it's a conversation worth having with your engineering contractors, literally with Pepco. And I think the lines are open. Last time I looked, but they'll answer the phone. They'll talk about it.
And just to contribute, I think that is a great point, the conversation with Pepco and the leveraging power that the town has, particularly since the outfall 15 is using Coleman Creek as a
Yes.
conduit to
Yes.
flush out that water. And as long as that is occurring, I think a very good offset
Mhm.
is to find out how much compensation we should be getting even on a monthly basis, as long as they are still using that. And we can't get there without a conversation with
Yes.
them, but that is a very strong bargaining piece
Mm.
that I think would benefit this.
I agree, and I would go, I would go, I would go ready. I would go, having done our homework, having done what research that we can do ourselves, but not like we're going and asking for favors. Like, it's a different kind of conversation to have, rather than, guys, what do you think? No, not not that conversation at all. So I didn't mention why I brought the boombox, incidentally, and this boombox cracks me up, actually. Someone actually paid me for a speech with it. They asked me what I wanted, and I said, I wanted a boombox. And what's disappointing about this one is, you remember back in the day when they called them ghetto briefcases, they had about 20 batteries.
D-side things.
D-side batteries were heavy. This thing is light as a feather. And it's got a rechargeable battery, which I assume is not replaceable. So I guess when this thing dies, I gotta throw it away. It's not like I can go out and get like 20 D-size batteries. So the stormwater lobby in this, it's very difficult because the state was pretty happy with the stormwater plan they had. This was like 2007, 2008. We were upset because we kept going to these construction sites where the silt fencing wasn't working. We went to one called Horse Pen Branch in Bowie. This was the one that really tripped it off. And there, the county had waived the stormwater requirements for the housing development. And so the flooding that ensued from just the natural, consequence of the construction started eroding at the rate of 1/4 of an acre on an adjacent neighbor's property. Her horse pasture started disappearing into the Horse Pen Branch. And there was nothing to hold the housing development to, because the county had waived the stormwater requirements. So she was kind of up the creek without a paddle, no pun intended, right? Yes. So in order for us to fix that problem, we had to get the state to own the reality that a good plan on paper is worthless if it's not working, right? We kept going to the state and the county, and they said, well, these guys built it exactly as we permitted it. And I say, yes, but it's still wrecking the near vicinity. What's the recourse? And so changing the culture of that meant doing what we call a performance-based standard. So in other words, you permit these on the basis of what will actually work. And if it doesn't work, then you modify it until it does, which was really not the mentality that exists even today, quite frankly, right? You file for a permit, you give them your concept plan, they approve the plan, you build it as, planned. And if it goes to heck in a handbasket, county's like, well, we did our best. Which, by the way, that solar farm we were talking about earlier is exactly that situation. We followed the plan exactly. So when I called the inspector, he came out and said, wow, this is perfectly compliant. I'm saying, my gosh, it's wrecking everything around it. Every neighbor has a flooding problem. And yet you guys think this is in compliance. So here's my point. We had to get the first owned if there was a problem. And that was the problem with the state. They had just finished redoing their stormwater manual. So like I said, we did posters, we did other stuff. But we also did this, every radio station in the state got a copy of this, and many of them actually played it. Here we go. The Busted Ecology Blues. CD that. Here and play. Is it turning? The thing about AV stuff, huh? Oh, I see. It's got to be in that one. There you go. Oh, maybe not. I don't think it's going to play. All right. Well, so much for retro boom boxes, huh? Oh well. Anyway, the point was we made it fun. A lot of people didn't understand the issue, but they dug the music. The posters really paid off. It took us, I think, 3 years to finally get the bill passed. And there was one hook in that bill, you can still find it in the law. And they say you have to protect the local hydrology to the maximum extent practicable. It's actually written into the law. And I remember the day of the hearings, we were fighting over practicable, not practical, practicable, meaning, is this something you can do, as opposed to, is this something that's impractical for economic or other reasons to do? But the developers will always say that, well, I could do that, but it wouldn't cost more. Like the guy that tells me he can do sustainable fracking. Well, yeah, of course, I think you can do it, but it's going to be expensive as hell. Right? Probably nobody's going to do that because it's not really practical. And so the state said, no, 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 we're honorable people. Practicable in this instance means exactly what we all agree it means. And we have fought ever since with developers who flip that term. Granted, it's not a Scrabble word, but practical and practicable are two different ideas. So we're still fighting that fight, but the stormwater game is upped a bit because it means new construction is supposed to emulate the existing hydrology on the site. In other words, copy what was already there before you built it in the post-construction phase. Here's a hook that a lot of people also don't know. We stole every bit of language for that bill from New Jersey. New Jersey, which granted mostly does redevelopment, has one of the strongest stormwater rules in the country. They did so because the governor well, he didn't get fired, he quit over a scandal. And on the way out the door, he signed literally every bill they put in front of him, including the stormwater bill, which later ended up in the New Jersey Supreme Court and prevailed. So oddly as it may seem, and New Jersey describes itself as a place that is more populous than Bhopal. That's what they've said to me in New Jersey. We have more population, more dense population than some of the most dense places in India. And so the idea is they're building and they're building and they're building. So there is some complexity surrounding whether a redevelopment standard is quite the same as a new construction standard. But I feel like we've taken a step in a positive direction, as much as it's upset a lot of people. And out of that, on the heels of that, came a movement to create these stormwater utility funds, which has angered a lot of people. They call them rain taxes. But that's where that came from. So well, we have to be able to afford to do this stuff. So we got to monetize it. We got to find some way to raise money. I heard a legislator use the term capturing revenue, which always sounded kind of predatory. You walk past someone, they want to capture that revenue, right? But at any rate, so I wanted to give you that as background because a lot of people don't know where the heck that stormwater standard came from. It came from citizens. It didn't come from the government. It came from citizens who were upset with the government because the government wasn't doing its job. And that's why I said that we copy the model that we use is to empower citizens and communities to fight their own fights. That's the only way we know it'll get done. It'll get done no matter what, as opposed to the broader conservation movement, which is largely transactional, right? They'll negotiate an outcome. They won't ask for exactly what they need to have, but they'll find one that everyone can live with. The Bay Foundation people said it to me because they said that's pragmatic. It's pragmatic because it means you live to fight another day, as opposed to fighting a battle that might result in utter catastrophe or vanquishment, which I can't imagine, right? We live in a society of free speech. I can't imagine a catastrophe. But I think people who get paid for a living to do environmentalism tend to want to also protect their jobs, not just the environment. And a posture of being pragmatic protects jobs much more than it protects the environment, which is, again, why I think citizens need to be in these conversations to keep the players honest, to keep them focused, right? This is a river, the Patuxent River, that is the only one in Maryland to have enormous gains, only to see all those gains lost again. And it was done not through government action, but by citizen action. Citizens in Southern Maryland started raising hell in the 1950s about the dying fisheries and the wastewater plants that are upstream. By the way, if I hadn't mentioned 36 wastewater treatment plants north of you, all draining into this river. Not a single one of those plants in this part of Southern Maryland. I think of this as Southern Maryland. I know Southern Maryland doesn't think of Southern, but I think of it as Southern Maryland. So that's an important paradigm, right? Citizens have to be in the game. It's not experts, it's not professionals, it's not paid flacks. I can remember in the 70s and 80s when nobody had a job being a full-time environmentalist. That the joke was you had to have a spouse with benefits and a pension if you wanted to be a full-time environmentalist. Now you have this entire cadre of entitled environmentalists who not only expect to get paid, they expect to be well paid. And that limits their vision for the work they're prepared to do. If it doesn't pay, they're not going to do it. It's just that simple. So I think Eagle Harbor knows that because it's a small enough place with a small enough tax base. It's accustomed to doing for itself, finding innovative solutions. Right. Some of the work that we've done with the town, we hope, is to help the town move into some realms where they can attract new and better funding, because you're competing with all those other municipalities out there, right? Maryland Municipal League and all those guys. My impression is they work much more strenuously for those bigger towns because they have a bigger voice. But small towns of any stripe obviously have trouble competing for those federal grants and set-asides and the various things they need to not only comply with existing environmental laws, but to plan looking forward for things that maybe haven't been covered by the laws, but that are very real threats to the community. You know? Yeah, my impression too, and again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a guy who studied this, the upland part of the town is probably pretty secure. I can't imagine the water getting that far up there, but the frontage areas could really take a beating. I mean, future flooding without some kind of an intervention or plan or something of that sort. Next slide, please. There might be a sequence of it, you just gotta talk about the same general stuff, but, and I didn't want to patronize you by telling you stuff you full well know. The town knows as well as anyone what's going on with that creek and what it's done for the roads and so forth. Next slide, please. Yeah, you get the picture. Next slide, please. Yeah, rough stuff because of all that transport, all that sediment and other goop and other stuff that comes through goodness knows what. You know, up where I live, there's a creek on our farm, and it has been channeled upstream. People have done stuff to it. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to play with my G.I. Joe in that stream. You could probably drink the water. Today it's a mud hole, you know. Every stream in this county is in what they call the red zone for water quality. Right. This 50-year clean up the bay movement hasn't cleaned up a single river after billions of dollars and millions, you know, and 50 years of trying. I'm not saying they're ineffective movements, but they're movements that don't thrive nearly as well with a community mass behind them. It's the community that gives them their teeth. It's the community that gives them their commitment. If it's a paid endeavor, it disappears when the money stops, which is quite frankly most of the environmental work that's funded out there. So we have thrived or survived anyway as an organization of Patuxent Riverkeeper, largely through litigation recovery. We've actually gotten money out of some of the lawsuits that we filed. The dock in our house, in our office, was paid for entirely by litigation proceeds. The judge decreed it, actually, build those guys a dock. That was the history of the waterkeeper movement, which started literally as a bounty hunting movement. The original waterkeepers on the Hudson used something called the Rivers and Harbors Act, which allows you to prosecute a polluter and then split the fines with the government. And they became one of the most robust waterkeeper organizations in the world. I think they have 12 attorneys on staff right now. And the Hudson, as you know, is an enormous ecosystem, right? Huge. Questions, thoughts, observations?
So what you would do to clean up this river? What is the grade of the river today? And what are some things that we can do, as small as we are, the second smallest municipality, to do our part to it?
So it's a real sin. This river has a D-, right? It has for 20 years.
Wow.
There's not even a plan. I'm not aware of a single plan to actually change that. Right? We have the only river commission in the state of Maryland, which at the moment is doing useful work. Believe it or not, after all that dogfighting with Hogan in the last go-round, this is the commission that currently has good leadership and a really solid mandate. It was set up as an independent commission. That kind of throws into relief the idiocy of what was happening, right? Hogan threw 5 of us off of that commission. We don't work for Hogan. It's an independent commission. That's why the General Assembly could put us back. Right? Think about it. How did they put us back if it was the governor's commission? It was never his commission. Now that we have this commission, though, we also are subsumed by this weight of this giant Chesapeake Bay program, which is leaderless and rudderless at the moment. In fact, the head of the Chesapeake Bay program, I think, was reassigned about 3 weeks ago. I don't know who's in charge at the moment. They're looking at their metrics, they say, for the next few years, but there's no solid or concrete plan. Right? So that's the problem. Now let me get to the answer to it. It is, I believe, citizen activism. We have always been able to get something done if we were organized, right? And we had a base of support behind us. They say that's how the Patuxent movement got off the ground. Senator Bernie Fowler in Calvert County had a, quote, cognizable political base sufficient to swing votes over the issue of whether the river was clean or not, which really is what people want to know. They don't want to know to the nth degree how much sediment, how much pH, how much nitrogen. They just want to know, can I swim in it? Can I drink it? And can I, water my plants with it? So I think what the town can do is be as vocal as you need to be over your water quality and the things that affect it, which might include your neighbors, but it may also include some practices here within the town. I think the town has a designation now, to a sustainable community, right? Which sets the stage, I think, for more sustainable practices. And we'll be happy to work with the town to help find money and other things to help fund some of those practices. I'm thrilled that the Patuxent River Commission has actually made it part of their mission to help the town. find resources. And I think there are other towns on this river that likewise could use the same kind of assistance. And so I would, while you've got their attention, I'd say go for it. While you-
So what would be some of those practices they get working?
So there might be offshore things that can be done to reduce the velocity of the water that it hits before it hits the town and creates damage. That's one possibility. I'm told by the engineers that Truman Point actually provides a huge benefit to the town by blocking from the north. Was it northwest, I think, the northwestern, or was it northeasters, whatever the heavy winds are. Some of those storm surges get protected because of that sandbar, basically, it's a big old sandbar. So it's sacrificial, truthfully, unfortunately. I know the town has talked about building stuff on it. I'm pretty sure it's kind of sacrificial. The idea being that the storm would take the point before it would take the town. Do you know what I'm saying? They have another example of that out in the Chesapeake Bay. Do you know about Poplar Island? Poplar Island's an interesting place. It's the biggest construction project of any kind on the northeast seaboard. They're taking dredge spoil out of Baltimore Harbor and dumping it into cells out in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay to restore a barrier island that once existed there. It's called Poplar Island. It's a really bleak place. If you go out there, it's just like being on the moon. The last time I was out there, I thought this would be a heck of a place to have a Halloween party because it's so creepy out there. Nothing grows because it's all sediment, you know, there are no trees. Yeah.
Now, the outlet, we have Pepco.
Mhm.
Now, I guess years back, that water used to be about 4 or 5 feet in depth.
Okay.
And right now, it's about maybe 30 inches of silt on the bottom over there.
Yeah.
And all the silt that's been trapped over there. And what would probably be the best way for the injustice for the town?
Yeah.
Because it's closed that little cove up.
Right,
Because all the sediment has been trapped over there where it used to be navigational for water.
Right.
And now it's trapped, but if that jetty went there,
Mhm.
your example was that Truman Point would allow, is blocking
Mhm.
the water from carrying away the shoreline. Now, the opposite effect for this jetty on this side of town is causing the sediment to be trapped and then it's filling in.
Yeah. So I don't know what the long range solution is. I mean, the short range one is an economic one. It's expensive as heck, but right, it's dredging. But again, as we said earlier, if you haven't fixed the source problem,
Right.
are you stuck with dredging? Which, by the way, is what Columbia is doing. Those lakes, they're not really lakes, right? They're stormwater, man-made stormwater ponds. Kittamaqundi, Lake Elkhorn,
Right.
right? And people are mad because they had put waterfront property, only to find now they can walk across the water. Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir.
You know, just observation that you mentioned before, and I'm gonna segue into what he was just talking about.
Mhm.
You know, talking with Pepco with knowledge,
Yes.
you know, with knowledge base, just what he's talking about, some of these other things. And going in there without drawing a line in the sand, like we're ready to litigate.
Right.
But it's a win-win situation for everybody, just, you know, partnering with them to do something, you know.
Yeah.
But you have to, like, say, go in there with the knowledge base and where it's a win-win situation. Pepco, they've had funds and so forth. If we develop that rapport with them, the right kind of.
Yeah.
You know, I think they'd be willing to, you know, to share.
I
Share the
agree.
experience and so forth.
I think you're well positioned right now. You've got legislative support, you've got a commission behind you. I think you have a governor that's probably sympathetic. They're gonna act right, but you gotta make the ask.
Gotta make the ask and ask it the right way. And that's like we're going to go strong arm or anything like that. This is a win-win situation. You're doing this, we have this knowledge base of what's going on.
Yeah.
You know, what are we gonna do?
Absolutely. Now, the plant itself is for sale, last I heard.
Oh, God.
Right. And I don't know what, I won't say anything that sounds racist, but what Chinese great company is gonna buy that plant and try and squeeze every dollar out of it? I haven't a clue. My suspicion is eventually they're going to ask for a pipeline across the river because they're running it off of natural gas. And so eventually, I think they're going to try and bring in something from Dominion, you know, the Dominion transshipment station there in Calvert. That would be my guess.
Do something like National Harbor, somebody can buy it up and.
Yeah. So, and by the way, that decommissions that cooling canal, right? The cooling canal is no longer needed because they're not burning coal. For years, we used to monitor the Patuxent River Keeper, the temperatures, and those were crazy hot surges coming out there, right? 98 degrees. Yeah, great. It was great in the winter for fishermen, but really rough in the summer because the hotter the water, the less oxygen, and so fish die. Marine life dies. So you gotta.
So all those pipes in the canal, nothing's running out of those,
Yeah,
the pipes in the canal.
the pipes are which.
There's, I don't know, maybe 9, 10 pipes running out of the ground into the canal.
Okay.
So are you saying that they're not utilizing those?
No, I'm talking about the actual channel. That's the cooling canal for the plant. There's an inlet,
Right.
just the south. That's what I was talking about. And you can actually paddle pretty far up in it, in like kayak or canoe, pretty far up into that, almost up into the plant.
The pipes you're talking about up in there?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah. There's about,
So is that where the pipes are? I don't think I've ever noticed them. It's been a.
yeah, there's about 9 of them.
Okay.
And you can only go up but so far. You got the
Mhm.
barrier there.
Right. So I don't know what those pipes do. My understanding was that somehow the water is circulating through the plant. It's cool. It comes in from the downstream through Swansea Creek, actually.
Right.
You can actually see the inlet.
Yeah.
And then it somehow filters through the plant to cool those cold boilers, and then it's discharged much hotter upstream into that canal. That's my understanding of it.
I see. So they probably still discharging water through those pipes.
If they do, maybe it's runoff at the plant grounds. I don't think there's coal related discharge. It's not hot water anymore. So I think that's a burden that the river has lost. And I don't think that hot water was good. In fact, they had something called a thermal variance, where the state had waived the federal standard so they could have that hot water discharge. All that's obsolete. All that's gone.
So we're not shooting in the blind. I see on one of the slides, you had Dr. Scott Wilson.
Yes. Sure, right.
And we are starting to develop a relationship and we have air monitors coming. Has there been any collaboration as far as those, the minds, the science of the University of Maryland as to help navigate some type of relationship to these power plants, like for instance, next door, burning of fossil fuels that seems to keep regenerating a lot of the environment to retool to more green tech.
Yeah, it's hard to compel them to do it without the lawmaking related to it. I was in Chicago 2 weeks ago where the EPA has been holding hearings over the new coal waste rule. And there were people literally there from all over the country, Native Americans and others, who are sick and tired of coal waste stuff in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in their cornflakes, for goodness sakes. Got too much coal. The problem is the feds have not declared coal as a hazardous substance, right? Which is a sticky point. If it's not hazardous, then it's just, you might as well put it in your cornflakes, right? I mean, how crazy is that? So there's a gap in the federal lawmaking that gives rise to this stuff. But like I said, that's not your problem anymore because they're not doing the coal. If I didn't mention, by the way, this was the first power plant of any sort, actually of coal sort, built on a tidal waterway. In 1969, 68, when they were building that plant, there were no others in the country. They weren't sure there was enough water processing through the total system to keep that place cooled down. So that was an issue. Actually, we have a former board member who was the scientist assigned to work on that project. He knows everything about that. In fact, we have most of his records in our attic at the office. But it's absolute knowledge. I don't think we'll be building any more coal plants, right? I mean, so, and this one they said was $1 billion upgrade. When we were last fighting with Chalk Point, they claimed they would close it before they would upgrade it because it was $1 billion they didn't have laying around. I don't know if that's true or not, because now.
It would be nice if they would close it.
I wouldn't shed any tears. I have thought about what would that scenario look like. It has industrial zoning with a railway going to it. So what comes behind it? What comes behind the coal plant? So I think we have to keep our eye on that ball too. The devil we know versus the devil we don't. Maybe we can regulate these guys into a posture. We had suggested at one point that all that surplus land around it should be solar panels, and that maybe the town could have a lease on some of that. Maybe the town could generate revenue from these guys, because I know they don't use that land. Maybe you could guilt trip them. I mean, maybe it's a fantasy, We know that, was it Highland Beach generates at least some revenue from their solar array? Why not Eagle Harbor? A town that could use some bucks, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
So I think that this is a very good conversation. One of the reasons why I wanted to have, Fred Tubman come in and speak after, Green Best came in and speak, is sort of building up on what I have seen. I've known Fred for quite a long time. And I understand like him that there was a time not too long ago that when you looked like us, you were the only person that was in that group. And so I get what you're saying, but I also think it's very important for the citizens and the landowners in Eagle Harbor to not only work together within your community, but I think that you should also work with other people that are surrounding you, that have vested interests. The persons that own home landowners across the way, working with Cedar Point, working with those people that are on land further uphill, when we're talking about sustainability and the impact of the Patuxent River and what is impacting you. It is not just Pepper. It is all of this land around here, and it's all of these homeowners and these landowners. And I hope that at some point you start working collectively. And the River Keep of the Patuxent River Keep is a good way to gather your strength, because it is the citizens, and there is strength in numbers. And just Eagle Harbor by itself may raise somebody's antennas, but if you collectively work on the people that own the land, that live here, that's going to be impacted by the climate change, because the climate change is not going to only raise the river, but it's also going to have more rain. And look at what we had a downpour that was just over Northernwood, Brentwood, and Hyattsville, of 5 inches of rain in an hour, and it was nowhere else. And that's the sort of things that we have to worry about. So I know we could probably talk for a long, long time, but it's almost 8 o'clock and you said 7:30.
Okay.
I hope that you invite Fred back, the environmental committee, invite Fred back, to bring some more people, from the area to have a much deeper conversation of what can you do. Our next, workshop is going to be about climate change. It is being presented by the Environmental Finance Center, that also received the same funding that I received to get this workshop done. And I hope that you all come to that, because I'm trying to just build on your knowledge and to bring people in that you can connect with, not only this one time, but continually connect in and grow. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. Okay.
Thank you for joining the Town of Eagle Harbor Workshop Series. Please join us for future workshops. Workshop number 3, August the 17th, Building Community Resilience Through Climate Action, Environmental Finance Center. Workshop 4, August the 31st, Sustainable Maryland, How to Become a Sustainable Community. Workshop 5, September the 14th, Small Systems Environmental Finance Center. Workshop 6 to be announced, Prince George's Department of Environment.